Chapter 12, Social Psychology, Lecture 2. Basic questions we're going to be looking at in this lecture. Social influence is the focus. What does the research on conformity, compliance, and obedience tell us about ourselves? How can we resist social influence? So social influence is one of those topics that I pulled out of this chapter to focus on. Personally, I find it fascinating. I think a lot of students find this stuff pretty interesting as well. So we're going to talk about conformity, compliance, and obedience, and then finally about how to avoid destructive conformity, compliance, and obedience. So I'm sure you've heard of these terms, conformity, compliance, and obedience, but have you ever thought about what they actually mean? So here are some definitions. Conformity is when people yield to the real imagined social pressure, that is, we go along with others in response to group norms. So, for example, when you enter a classroom, you typically sit down and you wait for the professor to come in, and then you listen attentively, take notes, and so forth. And you do what supposedly you're expected to do in that kind of environment. And pretty much everybody goes along with the show. So there's these norms, these rules of expected behavior and so forth that we're aware of. Most of them are implicit. That is, they're not written down anywhere, but rather we've learned them throughout our developmental history. And so we go along with the rules of the game. That's conformity. Compliance, that's when we change our behavior in response to direct requests. Obedience is when we change our behavior in response to direct orders. So there's a difference between complying and obeying. Think of compliance as me asking you, could you please get out a piece of paper? I'm going to ask you to follow a set of instructions. And you do it. In that instance, you would have complied with my request. If I say, get out a piece of paper, follow these directions, then if you do it, you would have obeyed. So there's a difference, a subtle difference between complying and obeying. But it's a difference nonetheless, with different sets of environmental conditions and social conditions that will set the stage for compliance, obedience, and conformity. So we're going to talk about three classic studies: conformity, compliance, obedience. So this is what social psychologists have come to understand about humans and social influence. So we'll talk first about Solomon Asch's classic study in conformity. We'll talk a little bit about Phil Zimbardo's study in compliance, the Stanford Prison Experiment, and then we'll talk about Stanley Milgram's infamous studies in obedience. So we'll start with Solomon Asch. And I want you to consider, as you're viewing the videos that I have associated with each of these classic studies, and as we sort of discuss this, take it to the discussion board, if you choose, what would you have done if you were the participant in these studies? So classic studies in social influence, first one we're going to talk about is the conformity study, the line study by Solomon Asch. So if you take a minute and pause this Tegrity lecture and go to the link I've provided for the Solomon Asch study. It's a little cheesy. It's very, very 70s-ish. You'll see a replication of this classic study by Solomon Asch. So if you pause it and go check out that video and come back, then we'll have a conversation about this. All right, so I'm assuming that you watched the video. So what Asch did was set up a study where the cover story was a study in perception, and as you saw in the video, the subjects were asked which of the comparison lines fits the standard, and then the idea was to see who would go along with the group and who would. What are the conditions under which people would conform and or not conform? So what the original study discovered was that in 37% of the trials, the subjects conformed, that is, they went along with the group and said, for example, line 1 fits the standard when it actually was line 2. Some of the factors that affected conformity was group size. So group size increased, that is, as it went from around 2 and then increased to about 7. Conformity increased, that is, the greater percentage of individuals went along as group size increases. But then 7 was kind of the magic number. Things kind of leveled off. That is, as Ash added group members, he didn't see a corresponding increase in conformity. So group size of about 7 was enough to create this sort of conforming sort of environment. The lesson learned from the Ash study was that people frequently will alter their behavior to conform with others. And in the video, you hear a couple of different kinds of conformity going on there. You had normative influence and informational influence. Normative is when you go along, that is, you cave to group pressure because you don't want to stand out, you don't want to be the deviant, you want others to like you. So when we conform in response to social pressure and it's normative, then we're conforming because usually we want to be liked. We don't want to be seen by the group as the deviant. And then informational influence is when we basically accept other people's version of reality as being the truth. This is informational influence. We question our own perception, we doubt our own judgment, and we rely on what other people are telling us to be the case. And sometimes others are right, and sometimes others are wrong. But in both cases of normative and informational influence, we go along with the group, but for different reasons. So this is a quote from Ash pertaining to the results of this study, this classic study. And here's what Ash says: that reasonably intelligent and well-meaning young people are willing to call white black is a matter of concern. It raises questions about our ways of education and about the values that guide conduct. So this is a weighty statement. And what Ash is saying is this. He's saying that these young people were willing to deny their own reality, what their own senses and perceptual processes were telling them, because they wanted to go along with the group. So this is the second part of this, the values that guide conduct. If the conduct is going along with the group, what do we value so much as individuals that would support us denying what we know to be the truth or what we believe to be the truth? What is so important to us that would lead to that sort of situation, that sort of behavioral outcome, conforming, going along? And the answer is, we want to be liked. We want to have a sense of belonging. There's something basic to being part of a group, to feeling like you're part of a group. So basic that you see groups sprouting up all over the place. The internet is a perfect example. People want to belong. They want to have that sense of belonging. And I think there's something basic, and what I mean by that is if we roll back the hands of time, thousands and thousands of years ago, it probably meant certain death if you were ostracized or shunned from the group. That is, if you were shut out of the fire ring, that the tribe shut you out, then it was probably nearly impossible for you to survive on their own. So we probably have this natural inclination to want to be part of a collective. It's good for us in many ways to be part of a group, both in terms of our mere survival and also having all the support that a group can provide. So what do we know based on the Ash studies? Well, people will go along under certain conditions with others. They will conform. And in some cases, conformity can lead to destructive conformity. That is, if the group is inclined to harm other individuals, then we might go along just to avoid being ostracized by the group. We want to be liked, so we find ourselves doing horrible things. Or we might believe that the group is correct in its judgments. That is, we buy into their version of the truth and we go along with it. And this could lead to problems, obviously. So one of the other studies is the compliance study. Philip Zimbardo did a classic study, infamous study called the Stanford Prison Experiment. So if you can, just pause this video, watch that clip on Phil Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment, and then you'll see Zimbardo sort of explaining what went on. So pause this and please do that. Then we'll come back. All right, so presuming you're back, you saw the clip on the Stanford Prison Experiment. What Zimbardo did, as you know, is build out a simulated prison in the basement of the psychology building at Stanford University, and he randomly selected these young men and randomly assigned them to the condition of guard or prisoner. And then he prepped the guards in such a way so that the expectation was that they would maintain order, and they were given signs and symbols of authority, the uniform, the nightstick, and so forth. And then the prisoners were given smocks to wear and other signs of their sort of subservience. And then Zimbardo sat back and let individuals play out their roles. So each person played his role. This was what was surprising about this study, is that everybody sort of went along. Typical guard became sadistic. Typical prisoner passively went along. The lessons learned from this study is the power of social roles. So think of a job that somebody is given or that they choose and they win as being a role, and people are inclined to want to live up to the expectations of the role, particularly if it involves their job. So what's surprising about the Stanford prison experiment certainly was their job. They were getting paid a little bit for it. But they could have maintained their objectivity, and when things started going south, that is when the guards became sadistic and prisoners began to be abused, they could have just quit. But you didn't see that, by and large. Most people went along with the show. So the power of social roles was illustrated in the Stanford prison experiment. You give people a role, you put them in the context, and people will fulfill those role expectations, even if it means doing things that are inconsistent with the kind of person that they believe themselves to be. This is the power of the situation. The second lesson was that compliance breeds acceptance. That is, I may enter a situation, take on a role that is inconsistent with the kind of person that I believe myself to be. Either things that I believe in from a moral standpoint or some other important standpoint, values and so forth. But as long as I play that role and I comply with the expectations of the role, that over time I will convince myself that what I'm doing is all right. I may struggle a bit, but yet I will still continue to play the role. So compliance breeds acceptance. Eventually, by playing the role, we become that person. We convince ourselves that, yes, this is who I am and this is what I do. So what did we learn from Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment? Is that people will adopt roles and live up to the expectations rather readily, even if they involve behaving in a way that's abhorrent, as in the case of the guards, or passively accepting one's fate, as in the case of the prisoners, and that compliance breeds acceptance. Then the last study I want to mention here is the classic obedience studies by Stanley Milgram. And a little backstory on the Milgram experiments. Milgram was a young social psychologist at Yale back in the 60s, and at this time there was a huge media event going on, and that was the trials of Adolf Eichmann, who was the architect of Hitler's final solution. Adolf Eichmann set up all the demographics surrounding the shipping off of millions of people to their deaths to concentration camps. So after the war, Eichmann had fled Germany, and the Israeli secret police had discovered him living in Argentina, so they spirited him back, and he was tried for crimes against humanity. So this was being televised, and it left a lot of people wondering, ordinary, well-meaning, decent people like you and I, wondering, how could he have done this? How could somebody have done this to other human beings? And so the question becomes, is it something about the German character? Is it something about their disposition? Is it something evil within this individual that caused him to do this? Or was it the power of the situation, or some combination of the two? So Stanley Milgram, the good social psychologist, set out to answer that question. And he hoped to illustrate the power of the situation. That is, the situation can be so overwhelming in some instances that it'll override our disposition. It'll override everything that we believe about ourselves, and we'll find ourselves doing things that we wouldn't believe ourselves to be capable of doing. And that's what happened in the Milgram experiment. So take a moment and watch this clip. And this is a replication, an actual replication of a portion of the Milgram experiment. It's just enough to give you a sense of what that study involved. So pause this and take a look at that. All right, so presuming you're back, again, what would you have done? If you were the participant in the Milgram experiment, what would you have done? So here's the basic setup. You had the experimenter, the confederate of the experimenter over here, the A, that's the learner, and then you had the research participant, the subject, delivering what he believed to be, or what they believed to be painful electric shocks to the learner upon the learner's mistake. So the cover story was that this was a study of the effect of punishment on learning. The subjects were the ones delivering what they believed to be painful electric shock. No electric shocks were being given, but the situation was compelling enough so that everybody believed that that's what they were doing. So the idea was this: how far would the subjects go in the shock generator? How far would they go before they said, nope, I'm not going to do this anymore? So prior to this study, Milgram interviewed experts in human behavior who estimated 1 to 3% of subjects would deliver the highest level of shock. In the initial iteration of this study, it was done a number of times under a number of different conditions, and it's also been replicated cross-culturally and with mixed samples, and generally speaking, the results are around the same. About 65% will deliver the highest degree of shock. So this is inconsistent with what the experts believed to be the case. In fact, that 1 to 3% was based on the prevalence of sociopathy in the population. That is, 1 to 3% of people are psychopathic. This estimate reflects that fraction of the population who can operate without having any sort of consciousness or conscience for their behavior. So that was the estimate. Certainly this was surprising that most people, and we can say this statistically, most people went all the way. They were willing to follow the orders of a directive authority figure and harm another human being. So the lesson learned was this: people will often obey the orders of authority figures. And for some of these findings, the student might be saying, that is you, might be saying, well, isn't that just common sense? Certainly we know people will conform if the conditions are correct. We know that people will go along with role expectations, they'll comply. And we also know that some people will go along with the orders of an authority figure, right? But the question becomes for us is, as social psychologists and psychologists in general, what are the conditions that support this sort of thing? And in particular, what are the conditions that support destructive obedience, destructive conformity, and destructive compliance? Because maybe that's the kind of conformity, compliance, and obedience that we should be primarily concerned with. We're also concerned with those factors, those social factors that will set things up so that people will behave in pro-social ways. That is, go along with others to help other human beings. Certainly that is of interest. But the kind of conformity, compliance, and obedience that has gotten the lion's share of attention is the destructive type. So we know a lot about what the conditions are that will support this sort of behavior. Concept check for us. Students like yourself in a psychology class would be most likely to believe that if they had been a subject in the Milgram study, they would have administered. Now consider your answer to the question, what would I have done, before you answer this. So here are the options. More shocks than the typical subject, about the same number of shocks as the typical subject, slightly fewer shocks than the typical subject, vastly fewer shocks than the typical subject. The answer to this question, this is based on research, is that D is the correct answer. Vastly fewer shocks than the typical subject. Most of us see ourselves as being the kind of person, this is disposition, part of that equation. Behavior equals disposition interacting with situation. Most of us see ourselves as the kind of person that would never do something like that, but the research contradicts that notion. That is, if the situation supports it, we will find ourselves on occasion doing things that we wouldn't believe ourselves to be capable of doing. Power of the sun. So not all conformity, compliance, and obedience is bad. And that's what I mentioned before. That is, sometimes if we want to rally in support of a cause such as voting for women, civil rights, gay marriage, if you believe that this is an issue, or all of these are issues that, social issues that reflect unequal treatment of people because of some aspect of their human person. That is the only way that the Constitution was amended and so forth for women and for African Americans with respect to voting, for example, was because people got together and went along with each other and so forth, and were able to change laws that now we can see in hindsight were not good laws. We should be particularly concerned with destructive types, though. These are the types of social acceptance of social influence that have led to events such as the Holocaust in Nazi Germany and other events in history. So we should be particularly concerned with the conditions that support that kind of destructive conformity, compliance, and obedience. So one of the most powerful characteristics of a situation that enables people to resist conformity and obedience and compliance actually is having a non-conforming ally. And you saw this in the video on the Asch experiment. That is, as soon as you get one person, an ally, saying, no, it's line 2, it's not line 1, then you see this dramatic drop in conformity. Milgram also manipulated the presence of an ally. And again, what he found was that just having a single person disobey or stand up to the authority figure, he saw that obedience dropped off dramatically. So the power of dissent, just having a single ally, is one of the most powerful ways that we can resist destructive conformity, compliance, and obedience. Power of dissent. So I want to finish with this. Consider this. And some of you are familiar with this quote: the unexamined life is not worth living. A lot of people interpret this as having to do with psychology, right? That we need to look at ourselves and try to understand our behavior, examine our own lives and the way that we're living our lives, and understand our motivations and so forth. Because if we don't, we're mere puppets. We're responding to environmental factors that may be unidentified social roles and expectations that are implicit, and yet we go along with them. We may be responding to unconscious conflicts, issues that we have that are yet to be dredged up and examined so that we can get some rational control over them and so forth. So we need to look inward and find out what makes us tick. Otherwise, what's the point? We're mere robots, right? But that's actually not what this quote means. This quote is drawn from the annals of history, that is classical history. The Greek philosopher Socrates chose death rather than silence. He chose death because he considered participation in that type of conversation, whose goal it is to find truth and to search for wisdom, essential for the nurturing and growth of the soul, as well as for the health of the state, welfare in the state. So Socrates was a gadfly. He was a fly in the ointment of the Greek politicians. He was questioning, challenging their authority, and they gave him a choice. You either get out of town in exile, or you can go to prison, or you can kill yourself. So he chose death because he couldn't see himself living in a society that didn't welcome critical thinking, didn't welcome devil's advocates, didn't welcome a constant and concerted attempt to question the status quo and that sort of thing. So what really this quote means is that if I cannot think critically, if I cannot question authority, for example, then what is the point? So the lesson here from Socrates is to learn to think critically, and that's actually one of the goals of a liberal arts education. That is, students are learning to think, essentially, and to think critically. Because if you fail to develop a skill set that will support critical thinking, then what you are is a mere respondent to other people's arguments intended to persuade you to buy things, whether they're ideas or products or what have you. So plenty of people out there getting paid big bucks to try to get us to do what they want us to do. So the idea is that we learn to understand what social influence is and learn to think critically. Learning objectives: compare and contrast conformity, compliance, and obedience. Describe the procedures, results, and implications of classic studies in social influence. 3 we looked at today: Ash, Milgram, and Zabardo. Understand the role of an ally in resisting social influence. And then the last objective here: understand what a stereotype is and how they function in person perception. So be sure to read about stereotypes in the text.